Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
During the Reconstruction era, the federal government dissolved the governments of most of the former Confederate states and managed the states through the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a branch of the military. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help former slaves obtain food, medicine, housing, education, and land to aid in the difficult transition from slavery to freedom. Initially, the Bureau's focus was on providing the basic necessities for survival: emergency food, housing, and medical aid. But its larger role was to help freed slaves get an education and find work, and to try to ensure fairness in labor contracts. Prior to the Civil War, none of the Southern states had any kind of universal public school system. The Freedmen's Bureau took on the task of establishing Southern schools for former slaves to teach basic literacy. By 1870, over 1,000 of these schools were operating across the South. They also established 24 colleges and institutes of higher learning for African American youth. Many of these historically black colleges and universities are still operating today. Another issue was that since these freedmen were no longer slaves, they would count as full citizens in the determination of representation in Congress, rather than 3/5 of a person. But would they be allowed to vote? Southern Democrats were angered by the federal control of their states. Many took their anger out on the freedmen. Some whites formed secret societies to resist and disrupt the new order. These vigilante groups, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, included former Confederate soldiers, and they were essentially insurgent forces in opposition to the federal government. They used terrorist tactics of violence and intimidation to keep blacks and white Republicans from voting. The Ku Klux Klan would attack at night, wearing masks and robes to hide their identities. They intimidated workers for the Freedmen's Bureau and killed black political leaders and others. Former slaves Nellie Lloyd and Mac Taylor tell of their experiences with the KKK.
Us was never pestered by the Ku Klux, but I was given a warning once to watch my step and vote right. I watched my step and didn't vote at all that year.
Across the South, thousands of African Americans and white Republicans were killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations. Former General, now Senator Benjamin Butler, drafted legislation referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Another former general, President Ulysses S. Grant, signed it into law. The act authorized the use of federal troops rather than state militias to enforce the laws in the South. It also empowered the federal courts to try Klan cases and authorized the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Grant took full advantage of these powers and dismantled the Klan. It would be several decades before the organization would rise again. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States with equal rights regardless of color. This act was passed over the veto of President Johnson, and the policy was further cemented into law by constitutional amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, stated that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens of the country and of the state in which they live. It further required states to provide equal protection under the law to all their citizens and prohibited states from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited any state or local government from denying citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or having been a slave. It is certainly true that governments stretched and broke these restrictions over the following decades. But the amendments gave African Americans and others the tools needed to eventually force state and local governments into compliance. During this period, hundreds of African Americans were elected to state legislatures. 21 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, including 10 former slaves, and 2 were sent to the U.S. Senate, one of them a former slave. But these gains did not last. Once Southern states were redeemed and freed from federal oversight, they began finding ways to restrict the new rights of black citizens. The KKK and similar organizations had suppressed the black vote in the late 1860s and 1870s. In the 1890s, states created new constitutions that changed voter registration in ways that effectively stripped the right to vote from most blacks and many poor whites. Most prominent were literacy tests and poll taxes. African American leaders such as Booker T. Washington worked to have such practices challenged in court. But in the first years of the 20th century, the courts, as well as Congress, were not willing to fight Southern power on this issue. It would not be until the Civil Rights Movement, culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that these barriers would be swept aside and the intended goal of the 15th Amendment would be realized. America's journey up from slavery took centuries. From the introduction of slavery at Jamestown to the 13th Amendment, almost 250 years passed. 500,000 Africans were shackled and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the Middle Passage to face a lifetime of involuntary service in America. Untold millions were born, lived, and died as slaves. In the colonial years, slavery as a practice grew in the South, while the North grew wealthy in the slave trade. At that time, there were few voices crying out against slavery. Soon after the American Revolution, more voices joined the chorus, including prominent men such as Benjamin Franklin, and influential slaveholders such as Thomas Jefferson. Many believed that slavery would die a slow death. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery from an enormous territory and was a tremendous achievement. But the cotton gin gave slavery new life. As the wealth generated by slavery made Southern planters more and more powerful, they changed their attitude towards slavery from being a necessary evil that they hoped to be rid of in the future to a positive good, benefiting both the slave and the master. Slave insurrections and escapes, particularly in the early 19th century, led to harsher conditions for slaves. Meanwhile, Northern abolitionists looked at the horror of slavery, and their outrage grew until it boiled over. Eventually, the election to president of a man who was outspoken against slavery would be considered an offense so great that most Southern states determined to leave the Union. Though the North did not go to war to end slavery, the South did start the war to ensure slavery's survival. The fall of the Confederacy meant the growth of federal power over the states. If the Southern states wished to maintain the privileges of states, in hindsight, it appears that secession was the worst possible way to do so. During the construction period, the governments of southern states were dissolved, and they were managed entirely by the federal government. Constitutional amendments and other legislation led to even more federal authority. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ended slavery forever in America. Though African Americans would continue to struggle against racial discrimination, they had finally risen up from slavery.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.
God's gonna trouble the water.